This is the Apparelist podcast, designed to bring you real-life conversation about high-level topics relevant to the decorated apparel community.
Well, let's get into the February episode of the Apparelist podcast. We're here to bring conversations that not only highlight the best of the best printing technology, but we want to bring forward those topics that apparel decorators might not think about. Today's conversation is definitely no exception to that. I am talking about shop safety, and you're probably thinking to yourself, no one has ever gotten hurt in my shop, or the chances of OSHA showing up are slim to none. But I'm here to tell you that today's guest is going to dispel some of those mythical thoughts and emphasize just how important shop safety is. Joining us today on the Apparelist podcast is Gary Jones, VP of Environmental Health and Safety Affairs at Printing United Alliance. Many of you have likely heard Gary speak on various webinars, industry podcasts. He even made a special appearance at the Apparel Decoration Summit in 2025. Gary, I am so excited to have you on the show today.
Oh, Cassie, thank you for inviting me. I mean, this is talking about safety, apparel decoration, screen printing is clearly one of my more favorite topics because it is something that's top of mind. And the position that I hold at Printing United Alliance is that, we work with our members on these issues. We get questions from them. We unfortunately get calls with problems and issues that have happened, whether it's an injury or OSHA citation. So it's always good to work with the industry, let our members, let the industry in general know what's going on with respect to OSHA safety. And it's a very timely topic because we got a new year and we want to start the year out on a good foot. So
yes, that's right. And I remember after you spoke at our summit last year, there were several people, after you sort of shared some stories and information, several people had come up to me and they're like, we have never even considered this. So I think continuing the conversation is really important. But before we go too deep into that, for anyone who has not heard you speak or not met you in person, can you just give us the quick elevator pitch as to how you got into the industry in the first place?
Yeah, that's an interesting story. Everyone has a story, obviously. Mine's just as interesting, I think, as other folks, especially from my perspective. But I originally did not intend to work in the printing industry. I kind of fell into the printing industry, which I think some people are. My background and training, if you call it that, is in I have a bachelor's degree in biology, a master's degree in chemistry, and I was working in a crime lab of all things. And so I always get questions about that. I have some interesting stories for a different podcast. But so I was looking for a chemist position. And because at the time, working for the government, probably, as you know, doesn't pay very well. So otherwise, if it had paid, I'd still be there. But I was looking for a higher paying job. I was looking for a chemist position. And there was an organization called Graphic Arts Technical Foundation, which doesn't exist anymore, but they were hiring a chemist. And so I applied there. They had filled the chemist position, but they were looking for someone to do environmental health and safety. And they saw my background and thought I was well suited for the position. And so they made me an offer. I took the offer and I haven't looked back. I'm now in my 39th year of doing environmental health and safety dedicated just to the printing industry. And it has been an awesome journey. It's a journey of continuous learning, and I continue to learn. Our industry is so large, the applications, the technology, what people make, produce, how they do it, the workflow, inks changes and things like that. And so my background with the chemistry, the biology fits nicely with environmental health and safety because there's a lot of technical things associated with environmental health and safety, and so they fit very well. And so I've used a lot of my background in my job, and it's really been, to me, very rewarding. It's been a very rewarding career.
And it's wild to think in talking about how that relates to the printing industry. But again, I think it goes to that rhetoric of so many people don't realize how expansive our industry is and just everything it touches. And even just that biology, that chemistry side of it even touches that side. So it's kind of
Sure. Yeah.
kind of wild.
the health effects of chemicals, understanding, the impact that they can have, understanding the testing, like how do you analyze for certain things, that all comes into play almost every day with what I do in helping our members with the EHS related issues. So, it is technical. It is a technical area, and so that background is very applicable to what we do and how we
Yeah.
help our members out.
Yeah. And actually, that is the perfect segue into our big discussion today, which of course is shop safety. But setting the scene a little bit here, um, what what would you say are the reasons why shop safety is so high priority for apparel decorators specifically? Because I think so many people don't consider what you just said. They don't consider the chemicals or working with this equipment or all these things as like a safety concern. So why would you say we need to change that mindset?
Well, it's interesting. I've had in my 39-year career, I've had of that's been limited exposure to apparel decoration. But the thing that I've been most impressed with that segment of the industry is there is a thirst for knowledge on safety and health. And so I think a lot of it is that there's a desire for on the part of a lot of participants in that segment of our industry. They're just not quite sure what to do or how to get there. And so to me, that's refreshing because I like working with people who want to know more and want to know how this applies. But from the broader perspective, I would say you really have two primary factors, I think, for safety. The first is really your employees. A lot of companies we work with in our industry are family owned. And so you have relatives that work there. You may have sons, daughters, husbands, wives, etc. Family-owned businesses tend to attract a lot of family members, and so obviously you want to protect your family. You also want to protect your employees, from concerns associated with what could occur in a facility. And the other one is the heavy, so to speak. Not that that is important, but it's OSHA. And OSHA is a lot of times I say it is a four-letter word. And so OSHA is the agency that's charged with developing and enforcing, and a key, capital E, enforcing health safety regulations. And so you have the combination of the two, I think, which really drive the need to look at what you're doing from a safe work practice perspective. What are you doing with your chemicals? Making sure you're doing the proper training. You're making sure that the equipment is properly guarded and things like that. Because you have those two factors that are important. You want to protect your employees, and if heaven forbid something should happen and it turns into a really severe, serious situation, OSHA is going to be there. There are certain requirements under the OSHA regulations that you have to report to OSHA if you have an injury that involves hospitalization for treatment, if you have an injury that involves an amputation, if there's an injury that involves loss of an eye, which luckily doesn't happen in printing that I've experienced. Those are
Ugh.
all reportable within 24 hours to OSHA. If there's a fatality, which unfortunately we do have fatalities in printing, if there's a fatality, you have to report that within 8 hours. And typically, that's going to generate an OSHA inspection. They will send an inspector. There was a time during the peak of COVID where they sent letters, but for the most part, you're going to have an inspector showing up at your door, and they're going to start asking some tough questions.
Yeah. Yeah. And to sort of piggyback on that, I remember in my previous life, I've sort of always worked in the printing industry in some form or fashion. But in my previous role, I kind of worked more on like the hard goods, the laser engraving side, things like that. And I remember there was a pretty regular reader of our magazine at the time that just had OSHA show up for a random inspection. Just showed up, and they had to shut down business for a handful of weeks because they didn't meet a lot of requirements and they were scrambling and there were all these things. And so I think that's really also an interesting, thing that sticks out in my mind is like, just because you didn't have an accident or something
Right.
doesn't mean they might
Well,
not show. I mean, they might still show up.
That's what I call it's your lucky day, and or unlucky day, maybe that's a
Yeah,
better way to look at it.
yeah.
And unfortunately, the printing industry, and that includes all the segments of our industry, we're designated as a high hazard industry for amputations. Because of that, we have reoccurring amputations that occur, and again, those are life altering injuries. The statistics are not great from an industry perspective because generally between 40 to 80 people per year, and think about that, let that number sit in for a little bit. 40 to 80 people per year are going to experience an amputation in the printing industry. And so because of that, we're put on a list, and then that just triggers inspections because we're on the list. And so the area offices, OSHA area offices, go through and they look at their what it's called a national emphasis program, but they look at their national emphasis programs and they say, okay, well, let's generate a list of the companies in our area that are on this NEP or this national emphasis program. Which one's in this one? There's several that go on at the same time. And so they generate lists and they just show up. They just come to your door and say, "We're here for an inspection." And and then you didn't necessarily have to report that injury. They end up at your door and they want to come in and take a look around and see what's going on. And I probably should add too the third element of other more common types of triggers for inspections are employee complaints. So, employee complaints drive a lot of inspections from OSHA's perspective. A common scenario is you have a disgruntled employee for whatever reason. Maybe they got disciplined or whatever. Maybe they're fighting with someone else and, on staff, who knows, but they'll pick up the phone and call OSHA. And one of the things about the OSHA Act, by law, is that the OSHA has to respond to an employee complaint if the employee, identifies themselves, lodges a complaint, then by law, OSHA has to respond. Now, their response can be somewhat less aggressive. They don't necessarily always have to send an inspector. They will send you a letter. And basically, the letter carries kind of the same weight where they'll lay out the complaint. And as a company, you're legally obligated to respond to that. If you don't respond to the letter, then they'd send an inspector. And generally, then the inspector's coming with an attitude because you didn't respond to the letter. So, but having those letter inquiries to me give you a lot more opportunity to present your case. In other words, like we've been involved in a lot of those, helping members write those letters,
Mhm.
and generally in most cases, we address the issue and say, here's, it's either accurate or not. And a lot of instances I find with employee complaints, those complaints aren't accurate. In other words, the employee's like, oh, I think they're doing such and such and so and so. It's not necessarily a violation of the regulation. So
Okay.
that, but it still can trigger the inspection. And then, one thing about OSHA inspections, just to make a point of that, if OSHA does show up at your door and they do want to conduct an inspection, you have a couple choices. First and foremost, you can refuse entry. I don't recommend it because they have the legal authority to do that. They will go back and get a search warrant
Oof.
and then they'll come back with an attitude. And statistically, the penalties are much higher when this occurs. But because I have a lot of people say, "Hey, well, somebody told me I can just refuse entry." And yes, you can temporarily, but they'll go back and they'll get the search warrant. They'll go to a judge, they'll get a magistrate, and they'll be back, right? So. And then secondly is that you need to have a response plan. You need to think through this. What would you do if OSHA showed up on your door at 2 o'clock this afternoon?
Right.
What would we
Right.
do? So actually, and then the other thing is, while OSHA is conducting the inspection, they can cite anything that they see. If an inspector is there, say for a machine guarding issue or whatever, but they walk by and they see that there's chemicals that are in open containers, there's no labels, whatever they see, they can cite and are required by their enforcement guidance to actually cite that. And so anything that's in plain view is also open game for. So you're better off getting a letter quite frankly, because you don't run that risk of having an inspector there. Um, and I know we may talk a little bit later about resources, but I have a OSHA inspection response guide that I just got done preparing, and it's going to be made available very shortly. It's in design right now, so it's
Oh my
complete
goodness.
and it's comprehensive. And the reason why I did that is that because it talks about to basically think of as an anatomy of an inspection. What happens from the second that the inspector shows up your door? What do you do as a company? How do you respond? There's some draft policies in there. There's forms for you to take notes. What your rights are during an OSHA inspection, what the employee's rights are during an OSHA inspection. It's very comprehensive because what can happen from my experience is that if you are find yourself in that situation, you end up getting a citation. You have several choices. What you can accept the citation, pay the penalty, or you can fight the citation. I generally recommend fighting the citation, at least going through the informal conference. But and you have 15 working days. So when you receive a citation, don't ignore it, because if you ignore it, it can get worse, right? So you have 15 working days to do something. So you can start that process. But in some cases, we've had members that contest citations and they end up actually going to court. There's a whole process, but you go in front of an
Wow.
administrative law judge. If you don't like that, you can actually go to the circuit court. I'm actually following a case right now very similar to our industry. It went to the U.S. Sixth Court of Appeals, which actually remanded, which means sent the case back to the administrative law judge to rethink their answer because the court didn't agree with the answer. So you can contest these things legally. You can contest them, but it could take a period of time. So the guide has a note like fill out like what did the inspector ask? What photos did they take? You take photos. It's something to capture all your ideas while it's fresh in your head because you may have to like 6 months from now have to go back and recall what happened. So it is a guidance document. I like it. It was a passion of love, so to speak, a work of love. It took me
Okay.
quite some time. It is very comprehensive, but it'll be a resource that should be available. I would say surely within a month. As fast as it gets through our design department. It's editorially, it's done. Technically, it's done. It's just a matter of making it, match our other products that we have. So it fits in with the brand. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I cannot wait for this resource to come out because I think that's a huge hang up for a lot of people. Why they don't get their journey started is so they just maybe aren't sure where to start or what to do. So we'll make sure in the show notes to make mention of this when it is live. We'll provide links and we'll let members know, like all that good stuff. Um, we'll return to that at the end of the episode.
Sure.
Right now, I'm curious, and I don't want to get like grim and grisly here, but I think I want to ask you if you could share some tales of terror from some members that you've worked with, because I think in order to really kind of emphasize the impact that accidents and not following proper safety protocol can have, they can be pretty serious, right? And so I
Oh,
kind of want to
yeah.
hammer home the seriousness of this. So can you share any real life examples with listeners of things that you've seen and members you've worked with?
Want to level up your skills or empower your workforce? Meet iLearning Plus, the online education platform powered by our parent organization, Printing United Alliance. With on-demand courses and certifications, iLearning Plus helps print professionals stay ahead of industry trends, sharpen their expertise, and grow their careers. Whether you're elevating your skills or training your team, we've got the resources to keep you competitive. Printing United Alliance members save 20% on all courses and certifications. So get started today at ilearningplus.org and build a stronger future in print.
Sure. Yeah, I think that does help illustrate the significance and importance of safety. But you really have, when I look at safety, I tell folks, okay, it's a sometimes it can be overwhelming. Like where do you start? What do you do? I always like to have folks focus on the things that can really cause life-altering injuries or fatalities, those types of things. And so when we apply kind of like that type of hierarchy to priority, what immediately jumps to mind is equipment safety, machine safety, equipment safety, interacting with equipment. What happens is that the risk for a serious injury obviously is really directly proportional to interacting with equipment and machinery, because that's where we tend to get, when I mentioned amputations. Well, generally those amputations are usually associated. I don't know, very few are that in my experience are all associated with interacting with equipment in some way, shape, or form. So it's that equipment machine human interaction, as I call it. And every time you have machine human interaction, your risk is high, is really high. So part of what part of what we like to really have people focus on is their machine safety, and that boils on to machine guarding and lockout tagout. Why are those important? Because what happens in a lot of instances, and there's been a rash. I know we've talked about this. There was a rash of inspections that have occurred with automatic screen presses primarily, and the automatic screen presses. Some of them are guarded well, and some of them are not guarded well, and really what has triggered these inspections were injuries. So what happens in instances is that the operator will be for some reason want to step between the units, and then the press will index. And then when that index happens, there's a lot of force on that indexing of the machine. And so the people are between the units in indexes. And so we've had some pretty tough injuries as a result of that. There was one where a gentleman was down on his hands and knees doing something, and it indexed, and he happened to bring his head up a little bit, and it was a central power. So it grabbed and ripped his ear and the side of his face off because a machine index grabbed it while he happened to be looking up. The question is, why are you in there on your hands and knees? That I don't have the answer to that
Yeah.
question. But we do know that that was one that triggered an inspection.
Yeah.
We see, and a lot of times those pallets are about chest high or so we get a lot of broken ribs. And
Mhm.
so, when that when that piece of equipment's indexing, there are some of them have like a stop, like an interlock that would stop, but even then, they hit with a lot of force, and it usually ends up with broken ribs.
Ugh.
Unfortunately, and then one, which is always the worst case scenario, is a fatality. I literally have a video of a fatality on a clamshell press, single unit clamshell press, that I think the safety was disabled, but the operator was doing something, reaching in to do something, I think, with the screen, and their belly hit the on button, and it
Yeah.
cycled on, and the clam shell comes down and traps the person. Nobody was around, and they were asphyxiated, and you could see this person literally losing their life in front of you on this video. So I do show these videos when I do some training,
Yeah.
because even though they're hard to see, hard to watch, it's very illustrative of the fact that, and I think a lot of folks think screen equipment, in the world of printing, you have you have different sizes of equipment, you have different types of equipment, you have big commercial litho presses, big newspaper presses, and then you have screen presses. People think, oh, screen presses, they're innocent, and they're not, right? Because even on a simple clamshell press, you can lose your life.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
so, to me, safety from my perspective starts with the the types of situations in human machine interaction that can lead to amputations, that can lead to serious injuries, can lead to fatalities, and you start your program there. You start focusing on that, and then working down to lesser type hazards, you know what I mean? Another area of big concern, a lot of fatalities recently we've had, some in printing, are loading docks. Loading docks and
Oh.
forklifts. Loading docks and forklifts are areas of high concern for us. We've had people that have driven off loading docks. We've actually had people this is not a screen printing, but a packaging operation. Last year, someone got backed over by a truck because they were pulling
Wow.
up the loading dock. And And you wonder, how can that happen? Like, I have a hard time envisioning how that can happen. But if you're in a busy loading dock area, you can see how that could possibly happen because lack of communication is occurring in that area. And so, and then a lot of more times than not, people end up getting struck by forklifts, and those can cause very serious injuries. So, not everyone has a forklift, So I understand it's only for the larger types of facilities or larger, but those are in our industry, and you've got to be very cognizant of. So I focus on machine safety, forklifts, that the stuff that's really going to cause those serious injuries and unfortunately can cause fatalities, and they do happen in the printing industry. Last year, there were 8 fatalities in the printing
My
industry.
God.
Now, it's nothing that you normally hear of, right? Because you don't like, oh, now I don't hear of all of them. I hear of some of them, but when you look at and I look at the statistics every year at OSHA statistics on inspections. I look at OSHA statistics on when you have an injury, like I said, you have to report within 24 hours or 8 hours. So OSHA keeps that, and it's publicly available, and you can go down and look through to see what those are. So I look at those statistics. I look at the inspection statistics. But yeah, there were 8 reported fatalities in the printing industry. Now that includes the entire printing industry, but from my opinion, that's 8 fatalities too many. Amputations. The numbers on amputations, they just stay stubbornly in that same range. And I say one amputation is too many because when you look at the circumstances with amputations and fatalities, they're all preventable. There's rarely people say, oh, it was a sudden accident. It's a way of papering over it. But if you look at the root cause assessment, root cause analysis, they're preventable.
First of all, like, I've heard you talk about some of these before, but some of these are new stories to me, and I can't imagine knowing all of this information and then not immediately going to your shop and saying, "We gotta tighten up," because I agree, one fatality, one amputation, one concussion, all this stuff, all to me would be unacceptable as a business owner, and I really hope that our listeners feel the same way.
Yeah, the reaction I got from my presentation at the summit
Uh-huh.
was really incredible because I had more than one person say, "I didn't realize, I didn't know, I was not aware of." And to me, that's what we need to do is we need to raise the collective awareness of everyone in our industry about these issues because they can happen. And when you experience something like that, that's devastating. It's devastating to you, to your company, to your workers, and that can have a long-term impact on folks. And you're better off focusing on prevention, clearly, than trying to deal with things after the fact.
Yeah. I think let's then shift gears into the more positive since we're talking about it and say, okay, we've talked about all this stuff, right? Can you give our listeners some basic steps they need to be taking now to create a safe working environment? What are things apparel decorators need to be doing now as they start to build their safety efforts?
Well, a couple of things we have a lot of these existing resources already available that they can go on our webpage and download.
Mhm.
I would circle back to say what I would say first and foremost is I would review my equipment. I would take a critical review of my equipment. I would look at is it properly guarded? Do we have the guards in place? And what we know is that some of the guarding that's provided on some of the automatic screen presses is inadequate. And so the guarding on that type of equipment needs to be enhanced. Secondly, what are my work practices? What safe work practices have I established? And we've helped some companies. This is not up on our website, but I have some, especially when it comes to working with the presses. You have 2 great resources information. First is your owner's manual. Your owner's manual has a lot of information. And secondly, we take and pop that into kind of a template of safe work practices. You need to take the time to define this is our expectation when you have to add color to a unit or you have to change a screen or whatever you're going to do. This is what we expect people to do. And then the third element of that, and you hate to say this, but you have to enforce it. In other words, you can have all the great safe work practice rules, but if people aren't following it, it does you no good. And eventually, it's going to be if and not when. So that you need that strong follow through. But I think that is critical in terms of where do I move my, to move my safety program forward, or to establish it. I look at machine guarding, you look at lockout tagout. Now, we didn't talk much about lockout tagout, but lockout tagout and machine guarding go hand in glove for protecting workers, especially with equipment. So lockout tagout plays a very important role, because the way OSHA looks at it is that if the equipment's doing its intended function and it's printing, then machine guarding applies. So once you stop that piece of equipment and you have to lift a guard, bypass a guard, or put yourself into a hazardous area, like step between units, then you have to have some way to prevent that machine from cycling or from turning on. And so you need a mechanism. Now, it could be breaking a safety cable, hitting a stop safe button, but you need something, right? And so you have to lay that out. You have to say, hey, when we're going to change a screen, here's our procedure. So you have to prevent, because in a lot of instances where a lot of those folks were injured, they weren't anticipating the equipment to actually index. And so you need some way to control. OSHA calls it hazardous energy, but you need some way to control that. And there's different ways to do that. But to me, that's where I would start. I would have that, because again, that's where we're getting a lot of these serious injuries. That's where we're having that happen. It's a human machine interaction, and are we doing it in a safe manner? And you'll be surprised at the number of times where you see a lot of inadequacies with guarding, or even work practice procedures where companies don't even have them. So, I would definitely start there.
All really good strategies. Hopefully, again, people are taking this seriously. Um, Gary, there's a lot more I would like to cover.
Yeah,
However,
yeah, yeah,
in the interest of time and in the interest of just like now empowering our listeners, we had mentioned this at the beginning of this episode, but you are available to Printing United Alliance members. So for any of the members listening out there, um, you know, can you just give some basic contact information, places, and we'll provide links in the show notes and all
sure.
that good stuff.
Yeah,
Where do they find
absolutely.
us?
Yeah, if you're a member of Printing United Alliance, you can reach out to me, ask me all your questions you have. We can point you to resources. I mean, we didn't talk about chemical safety or
Right.
PPE. That's all part of this, but be more than happy to do that. My email address is real easy. It's gjones@printing.org. Again, gjones@printing.org. That's probably the easiest way to get a hold of me. And then we can set up a time to chat and go through that. Or you can go on our website, the printing.org website. Under our library, we have a lot of, we just revamped our health and safety webpage, and we made it a lot more easier to navigate and find the resources. We're very excited about it. So I would encourage you, if you remember, to go on the website. You have to log in as a member to access the resources. And if you're not a member, we'd encourage you to become a member. It's pretty reasonable in terms of the price, the cost, and you get to access experts like myself across different areas. It isn't just environmental health and safety, but we have experts on many areas that you can access questions that you have, assistance, help that you need. It's really, to me, it's a really economical. I mean, it's like $495 a year for printer members, and that to me is really a reasonable cost for what you get out of it. It's a great return on your investment.
It's certainly more reasonable than paying thousands upon thousands upon thousands of
Oh,
dollars
yeah,
in a
and
fine.
paying hospital bills. Oh, yeah, and,
Right?
OSHA's penalties are gonna go up. They go up every January. They're gonna go up again. Even uh, the base starts at about $16,000 that they can hit you with. And citations that I see, average cost of citations are between $30,000 to $40,000 is where they start for our industry, and then we try to help negotiate those down and work with OSHA on reducing the penalties. So for the $495, you can maybe avoid a lot of that headache,
Sure.
and ask us questions. I mean, that's to me one of the most rewarding parts of my job is helping our members, and I it's not a you're not disturbing me. You're actually, reinforcing why I do this job is to help companies out understand and ultimately help protect the folks who work in our industry.
Yeah. Well, and let me just say from personal experience, while I don't own a shop, every time I'm writing an article on this topic or doing some sort of interview or some news breaks on legislation or whatever, Gary and his team are always available to me, and they answer the questions so thoroughly and in such a great way. So, yes, take advantage of that if you are a member. And speaking of which, we'll make sure we supply plenty of links in the show notes. Don't forget, all of you who are listening, that you can ask us questions about becoming a member if you are not a member. We're here to help.
Absolutely. I mean, as I said, that's what we're here for. Our mission, we're mission driven at the Alliance, and our mission is to help, fulfilling our mission is to help educate. And that's the key aspect of a lot of the safety requirements, the knowledge, and then the getting the tools to take action. But again, it's a partnership too, because the companies have to implement, they have to put things in place, implement, and follow through. So.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Gary. And to all of you listeners, don't forget you can listen to the Apparelist podcast on our site. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon Music, and Pandora. We are wherever you want to listen to us. Apparelist.com is where you can find even more information. Printing.org is where you can connect with Printing United Alliance and all the fantastic things that our organization offers to the industry. Gary, thank you so much.
Thanks, Cassie. Thanks for having me.